I think with the digital landscape, the official statistics will tell you Bangladesh has over 100 million internet users. But, if you look kind of dig deep into the statistics, obviously the way it's being measured has been quite questionable. And there has been a big sort of discrepancies between the official stats from the government versus the stats that you see from GSM and World Bank. GSM and World Bank are not, they also have their methodological limitations, but there is a massive delta. And so that really demonstrates, and the reason I kind of flagged that is because that almost demonstrates the beginning, or the start of, even if you're not counting the number of internet users accurately, then imagine what happens beyond that, right? So I think that's like your lowest hanging fruit. Surveillance is something that affects all of us globally, and I think oftentimes what's missed out in the broader surveillance debate, particularly among many of our Western allies, is that many of the surveillance technologies are developed in some of the largest democracies in the world. I think it's important that those debates are not only happening in the context of authoritarian regions, but also in terms of democratic regions.
Hello, welcome to this episode of the DigiPod. My name is Farieha Aziz. Today I have with me Sabhanaz, Rashid, Diya. She's the Executive Director at the Tech Global Institute. I'll be speaking to her today about surveillance reform in Bangladesh. Obviously, having gone through political crisis that in Pakistan we're also familiar with from time to time, how these things pan out. But there have been laws prior to this government, and now there's an interim setup. And so Diya, if you could please first tell us a little bit about your work at the Tech Global Institute, and then where is Bangladesh at presently, politically?
Thanks, Farieha, and thank you for having me here. I think just broadly, Tech Global Institute, we primarily work on digital rights issues in the Global South, specifically looking into how do we think about progressive accountability frameworks in a way that advances the voices and rights of Global South communities around the world. Bangladesh is one of the countries that we work in, but also I'm originally from Bangladesh, so it's definitely very close to my heart. As you mentioned, Bangladesh has gone through a pretty significant political transition. We've had one government or one specific regime in power for the last 15 years, with sort of three farcical elections in between. And so now we have come to a situation where, as a result of a student-led revolution, that claimed close to 1,000 lives in a span of only roughly about a month. The government fell, and the position was taken up, and an interim government was formed, which is being led by the Nobel laureate Professor Muhammad Yunus, as well as a group of advisors who have a combination from civil society, from judiciary, and other spaces. But I think where Bangladesh is at right now, obviously because of this political transition, even if we have political transitions, oftentimes institutions don't transition at the same time. And so there's a continuity of the same institutions. There's a lot of expectation on the interim government, and they have a very ambitious reform agenda, which is required because the country has had one regime in power, and that specific regime, was quite authoritarian in nature, enforced laws that were quite detrimental to human rights, but also ended up siphoning off large amounts of money, massive corruption. And it was happening at a time when, the stats would say that Bangladesh was doing really well economically. And while some of that was quite true, particularly in terms of our development indicators, there was a large part of it, behind the scenes, where the country's, basic infrastructure institutions were being crippled down, and sort of their independence being eroded, and the separation between the judiciary and the executive arms, increasingly narrowed down. So you have a situation where basically there was this complete centralization of power that led to massive erosion of people's fundamental rights, their ability to assemble, their ability to say whatever they want, and their privacy is being eroded. And many of the laws that were implemented at the time continue till date, but many of the laws that were implemented before that 15 years still continue to date. So the government right now, despite having all of the best intentions, has really a significant reform agenda amidst a situation where there is political volatility, but also the continuation of institutions that are inherently been under a specific patronage and that continue to implement some of the same practices of the previous regime into this regime.
Before we get into the surveillance reform specifically and what is happening right now, could you also maybe for the audience lay out what is the digital landscape in Bangladesh with respect to the laws and regulations that already exist?
Yeah. I think with the digital landscape, the official statistics will tell you Bangladesh has over 100 million internet users. But, if you look kind of dig deep into the statistics, obviously the way it's being measured has been quite questionable. And there has been a big sort of discrepancies between the official stats from the government versus the stats that you see from GSM and World Bank. GSM and World Bank are not, they also have their methodological limitations, but there is a massive delta. And so that really demonstrates, and the reason I kind of flagged that is because that almost demonstrates the beginning or, the start of, even if you're not counting the number of internet users accurately, then imagine what happens beyond that, right? So I think that's like your lowest hanging fruit. But we do have a growing economy. Year to year, internet growth is quite significant. And amidst that, obviously, Bangladesh has a pretty fragmented licensing regime. In terms of the operators, NTTNs, ISPs, IIGs, and so that has created a situation where it's hard for new businesses to enter the market. There are issues around competition. There are issues around consumer protection that are oftentimes quite challenging to navigate in a very fragmented licensing regime. On top of that, on the specific from a digital rights perspective, laws that have resulted in this licensing regime, the primary legislations or laws that govern the telecom sector writ large, have also been quite problematic in terms of having provisions around criminal liability that require the CEO or executives of these companies to be individually liable for whatever their companies do. There are clauses around data access that has been provided to law enforcement. So irrespective of the kind of protocols they have, every licensee is required to provide access to data to law enforcement agencies under the guise of national security. There are also laws that specifically have requirements around the kind of percentage shares you're going to have, the kind of dividends you have to pay, and sort of the structuring of the company. So fundamentally, I think the digital landscape is a bit of a hodgepodge of many legislations, many operators, many stakeholders. And I think that has kind of made the situation quite a bit compounded. On top of that, of course, the digital rights issues, because most of the laws in Bangladesh are not particularly conducive to rights from that perspective, particularly for consumer rights. And oftentimes, the people who are using these services are seen as economic units as opposed to rights respecting bodies or rightful bodies in that way. And I think that continues to be a challenge.
So what kind of issues have been identified, especially over the years, in terms of the laws that have been at the disposal of the government and how rights eroding practices have been in place, which has then led to some sort of surveillance reform or law reform debate in Bangladesh?
Yeah. I mean, if I just it's quite a lot of things, but I'm going to narrow it down for the sake of this segment. I think if we kind of focus on two of the rights, which is freedom of expression and privacy, for Bangladesh's constitution, similar to many South Asian constitutions or many sort of, I would say, post-colonial constitutions around the world, there are restrictions on speech, but those restrictions are not very well defined. So we have we have framing like public morale, national security, public health. Public health, I think we kind of figured what it could mean during COVID pandemic. I don't think we kind of knew it before that moment, but I think others tend to be quite poorly defined, and as a result of that, I think basing it off those poor definitions, you have a set of laws that follows that are specifically looking into the intersection between telecom, digital, and speech, and they kind of continue with the same pattern of restrictions. But in Bangladesh, I think it went a bit further with the Digital Security Act initially in 2018 and the Cybersecurity Act afterwards that had restrictions around things like, you couldn't say anything about that would hurt the sovereignty of the country or enmity between states. I think that's also in the penal code as well for most of the South Asian countries. And so it's a continuation of those same framing, but then enforced in a very broad, arbitrary manner without any kind of assessment around necessity, proportionality, and sort of around international human rights law. And so that's on the speech side of the house. And then Bangladesh lacks any comprehensive privacy framework. The constitution has a right to privacy provision, but again, that is subject to reasonable restrictions. And you see that being kind of captured further into the Code of Criminal Procedures, which is again a post-colonial, a wonderful gift for colonial overlords. And so you have situations where the law enforcement and security agencies under the Code of Criminal Procedures are also given unfettered access. And so in the absence of a central privacy framework or individual privacy framework, and that's sort of compounded by existing laws that give massive data access to security the security sector in the country, I think there's a huge sort of risk around sort of that rights also being eroded. So you have a combination of both speech rights and privacy rights both being eroded in that advantage. And of course, I think added to that, just in terms of giving a much broader context, is I think many of our countries are going through this national digitization of national ID revolution. And I think that also adds to, because you don't have a central privacy framework, and the privacy framework has its own sort of limitations. We don't have a rights respecting sort of governance structure to begin with. And on top of that, when national IDs are getting digitized, again, there is a huge risk of marginalization and exclusion of specific groups of people, women, LGBTQI populations, and others in the country. So that, I think the trend continues, the trend of censorship, the trend of privacy erosion, the trends of very deliberate exclusion and marginalization continues to till date in Bangladesh. We also host about 1.1 million refugees, working refugees in the southern parts of the country. There are different ethnicities living in the southern part of the country, in the Chittagong Hill Tracts. We have different religions. And so all of those identities compound with who is a citizen and what that actually means in terms of their rights in the country, and how digital ends up either advancing that narrative or perhaps exacerbating the same inequalities.
How have you seen some of these powers which grant access to data to law enforcement abused, or especially impact disproportionately marginalized communities or voices, especially in a political context as well? And is there any conversation around that is also calling for guardrails around some powers in the reform agenda?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Bangladeshis are quite, the Cybersecurity Act has been, widely sort of criticized for many years. And there are sort of a number of consultations happening now that is reviewing the Cybersecurity Act and potentially repealing it. There's lots of debates on that. And then on top of that, from the broader sort of privacy space, I think there are lots of debates looking into surveillance specifically. What are the powers of the law enforcement agencies? Who are the agencies who have such access? And I think, oftentimes I think people, there's surveillance and sort of how you kind of tackle it, but then there's also privacy. And I think there needs to be a bit of a combination of the two to kind of get Bangladesh to where it needs to get to. But yeah, there are a number of conversations around these various topics, specifically looking into, I think, less around procedural safeguards, but I would say more around who are the agencies who have access. Does it make sense for everyone to have access? If a user has a data breach, where should they go? There's a grievance redressal angle to it. So I think those are some of the debates that we're seeing emerging in Bangladesh right now, specifically from the civil society, but also from the private sector, particularly groups from the various operators, because for the longest time, there were provisions that required them to give mandatory access to user data. And I think that, and if a law enforcement agency comes to your office and says, if you don't give us access, we're going to shut you down, I think you don't really have a lot of choices at that point, and for your employees' security and safety. So I think there's a lot of calls from the private sector, domestic private sector as well, saying that this has been disproportionately abused. Huge amounts of data has been given, had to be given out, which has led to a culture of fear, censorship, surveillance, and this complete erosion of trust in technology and institutions. I think that is really where the discussion is happening in Bangladesh, instead of how do we rebuild that trust in institutions in a way that could protect people's rights.
Yeah, finally, because you obviously are tuned into what's happening globally, regional trends as well. And we hope that something good can come out of the Bangladesh reform agenda so that, we can learn from this. But generally, on the whole, where it comes to corporate responsibility for increased privacy, and then surveillance practices, which we are cognizant of, that it's not a very neat division between East, West, better democracies, because surveillance is that one issue where there's a huge question mark over the practices, even in Western democracies. What are some of the things, can you see any trends anywhere, reform practices, which we can adopt in the region, which are good, or what we should stay away from?
Yeah, really great question. I think you're right in the sense that surveillance is something that affects all of us globally. And I think oftentimes what's missed out in the broader surveillance debate, particularly among many of our Western allies, is that many of the surveillance technologies are developed in some of the largest democracies in the world. I think it's important that those debates are not only happening in the context of authoritarian regions, but also in terms of democratic regions and in terms of the companies that produce such technologies. I think one really critical example is Sandvine, which recently pulled out their operations out of multiple countries around the world. I think some 60 plus countries around the world. I have to check back on the number. But Sandvine is a Canadian company. And so it's really important that these kinds of practices continue, and that kind of, as we interrogate the world, we also have self-interrogation in mind in terms of how we think about surveillance moving forward. The second is, I think, in terms of just procedural safeguards. I think this morning I saw the US government releasing certain recommendations or guidelines around export of technologies, which specifically has a surveillance angle to it. I haven't looked at the guideline in full yet, but I think having kind of seen that evolve in the last couple of years, definitely when countries kind of put restrictions or guardrails or human rights due diligence and human rights assessments on top of technology that they're trying to export out to other parts of the world, I think those are the kinds of good practices. I would say that's quite important. That, of course, raises questions around who is doing the assessment. Do they have a global South context? There's a number of other questions that come up. But I do think generally those are decent practices. And then the third thing I would just say in terms of, both in terms of corporate surveillance as well as state-led surveillance, I mean, I think the majority world has the terrible, I would say, burden of a dual-edged sword in the sense that they're not only having to tackle corporate surveillance and corporate malpractice, but also government surveillance and government malpractice. So there's really nowhere for them to turn. And I think being able to have these dialogues with the global majority in a way that involves stakeholders beyond the state and includes civil society, average citizens, technical communities, etc., I think another really big part of being able to understand these issues better, and then being able to put out procedural safeguards, particularly on surveillance, import, and export, that are more cognizant of local limitations and laws and realities.
Thanks, Diya. This is really helpful to hear also, because in the Pakistani context, of course, we are talking about a so-called firewall or deployment of filtering and monitoring equipment, which obviously is purchased from countries outside of Pakistan, and then a surveillance regime that is in place in addition to the cyber crime law and practices under it. And I think there's a lot of regional learning to be done. And if we see one country in the region moving in a direction which seems positive, and we hope that something good comes out of it, I think that is the thing to keep our eyes on as well, instead of following the more regressive practices. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is all we have on the Digipod.